For the twin crises of the global environment and civilization's viability, solutions tend to fall into one of four categories. We'll take them one at a time.
The four categories of solutions, what I'm calling our Ersatz Saviors, are decreasing the number of children born through a modernization process called the demographic transition, growing the economies in poor countries, technological innovation, and a paradigmatic shift in human consciousness. First, modernism and the demographic transition. When contemplated, the human population curve is a frightening image. It represents an unprecedented phenomenon in human history, although not one that is unprecedented in nature. Given sufficient resources and a lack of predators, Charles Darwin had noted in The Origin of Species, quote, "There is no exception to the rule that every organic being increases at so high a rate that if not destroyed, the earth would soon be covered by the progeny of a single pair. Even slow-breeding man has doubled in 25 years, and at this rate, in a few thousand years, there would literally not be standing room for his progeny." Unquote. The problem, of course, is that a swelling population will eventually outstrip its resources, and at that point, the population crashes. It has happened to many species, from yeast in a wine vat to reindeer on Alaska's St. Matthews Island. We do not want to contemplate, much less experience, the horrors of a human population crash. We'd rather bring our numbers down voluntarily, and since we are rapidly using up Earth's resources, our numbers need to drop rapidly. The most obvious way to achieve this goal would be to have smaller families. And indeed, all over the world, families have become smaller. The total fertility rate, the TFR, can simply be defined as the average number of children a woman will have in her lifetime. Demographers estimate that globally, a TFR of 2.1 will replace the current generation. Anything below that number suggests that the next generation will be less numerous. The countries in green have fertility rates below replacement. About half the world's countries belong to this club, including some of the most populous countries such as China and Russia. For Japan and most of the European countries, the fertility rate has dropped far below replacement to around 1.5. Worldwide, the fertility rate has almost halved since 1950, from 5 to about 2.6 today. The blue line represents the global fertility rate. The green represents the fertility rate of less developed countries, and the yellow of the more developed countries. Because of this phenomenon, that steep J-shaped population curve of the past 65 years is expected to become gentler over the decades as population growth slows, and then eventually flatten out by 2100. The good news, then, is that we are voluntarily having smaller families. The not-so-good news is that the global population is still rising fast, at around 80 million people a year. That's a Germany every year, or 10 New York cities every year. The United Nations projects that world population will reach about 9.6 billion people by 2050, and somewhere between 10 and 11 billion by 2100. So, if fertility rate has dropped by half since 1950, how is it that the human population is still swelling so fast? The age structure diagram will easily explain this. Here the world population is divided into 5-year gradations, blue for males, red for females. We can see that the number of women that are of reproductive age or younger, shown by the green arrow, represents the majority of the world's female population, and it is still growing. Most of these women will have children in the coming years. And as long as women have on average more than 2 children, the population will keep growing. And since there are so many people already on the planet, this translates into 80 million additional people every year. That's 800 million additional people every 10 years. Looking again at the map showing fertility rate, we notice that most of the countries where fertility is low are located in the wealthier countries. The poorest countries, particularly in Africa, the Middle East, and Afghanistan, have the largest families. In some of these countries shown in red, couples are having 5 or more children on average. This has had the effect, of course, of further bifurcating an already divided world into wealthier societies and the poor, into the haves and have-nots. The societies with these high fertility rates tend to be composed of young and poor populations, tend to be the most food insecure, politically unstable, violent, illiterate, and patriarchal. And the strains of their ballooning populations will only make it more difficult for them to improve the lot of their citizens, and of the rest of nature in which they exist. the sustainability of these societies is in serious jeopardy. In this diagram, we can see that Africa's fertility rate has dropped from near 7 in 1950 to below 5 today. But that 5 is what the world averaged in 1950. At the moment, Africa is 60 years behind the rest of the world. And yet, demographers are projecting that Africa's fertility rate will drop to near replacement level by 2100, almost the same as every other region in the world. How do they expect this miracle to occur? Demographers hope that third world countries, including most of those in Africa, will follow in the demographic footsteps of the richer first world countries. The name given to this clearly arrogant and, at best, hypothetical phenomenon is called the demographic transition. The general idea is this. In stage 1, a mostly rural, poor society experiences a stable to slow-growing population. Because children are valuable contributors on the farm, and because they will take care of their parents in their later years, children are seen as a necessity. And because children are the most vulnerable to diseases, parents ensure progeny by having several children. So in stage 1, both the birth rate and mortality rate are high. In stage 2, improvements in sanitation, nutrition, and medicine lower child mortality rates and also help increase lifespans. Meanwhile, because cultural traditions take longer to change, birth rates remain high. Religious views on contraception and abortion and the value and status that a society may place on large families usually takes time to change. So in this second phase, with birth rates high and mortality rates low, a society's population swells. In stage 3, as cultural values and norms adapt to the new circumstances, fertility rates drop until births and deaths more closely match each other, and the population stabilizes at some new high. According to this demographic model, about half the world has achieved stage 3, those mostly wealthy countries in green. Most of the rest of the world is still somewhere along stage 2. In much of the Americas and Asia, fertility rates are dropping fast, and so therefore they are somewhere in the late phases of stage 2. However, most of the African countries between the Sahara Desert and the country of South Africa, those in orange and red, have just begun stage 2, and therefore have decades ahead of them in dealing with a population explosion. In 1950, the African continent was home to about 230 million people. By 2015, that number had quintupled to 1.2 billion. The United Nations Population Division expects Africa's population to double again by 2050 to 2.4 billion, and reach 4.2 billion people by century's end. The UN's 4.2 billion projection is assuming a considerable decline in fertility, and is therefore actually a rather optimistic number. So, what will be needed for countries in red and orange to lower their fertility rates? Put another way, what will encourage the present and coming generations to voluntarily produce small families? According to most demographers, economists, and other such analysts and experts, the solution can be summed up in 3 words: modernization, urbanization, and secularization. Given Iran's fertility miracle, perhaps secularization is actually less important. In Iran, the authority of the religious leaders encouraged changes in large-scale social behavior, lowering the fertility rate from 7 children families in 1950 to replacement levels and below in this century. However, most countries do not have leaders with such authority. The rest of us must depend on less direct, more subtle social influences. For example, in a modern urban environment, children are no longer financial assets to the family. Instead, they are costly. In urban areas, space, resources, and services become relatively scarce and therefore expensive. Apartments in desirable neighborhoods, good schools, well-paying jobs, proximity to health services and to parks and open spaces, tickets to art and entertainment, and so on. Competition for these resources and services is fierce, and so parents must raise successful children, children who can compete with their peers. They must be educated in the best schools parents can afford. They must be given extracurricular activities, such as piano lessons, foreign language, computer camps, to make them more desirable to private schools, universities, and employers. In a modern society, status now revolves around an individual's wealth and professional standing and children's accomplishments. My son is a doctor. My daughter attends Stanford University. And most importantly, since women are the actual bearers of children, women's attention needs to be diverted from children to careers. The best indicators for lower fertility rates revolve around women's literacy rates and education levels. Education delays marriage and children, and careers makes the hard work of raising children less attractive. In summary, the idea is that society goes from this to this. One crucial upside to this model is that civilization's lowered fertility rates, and therefore its population future, and therefore civilization's very viability, are based on women's empowerment. Nearly every significant improvement in society has been associated with women's empowerment. When women have the power to make decisions over their lives, and that of their families and that of communities, everyone generally benefits. The downside of this demographic transition model is that the problems of consumption replace problems of population. When people become better educated, they get better jobs. They make more money, and they spend more money. They buy more material goods, and they eat higher up the food chain, which usually means eating more meat, not so great for the animals. Or for all the remaining hungry people. Presently, 40% of all grain goes to feed for livestock. The world's present 800 million hungry people must compete with cows and chickens and first-world pets for their daily bread. This map, created by National Geographic, cleverly shows wealth distribution geographically and not simply by political borders. According to demographic transition theory, fertility will drop in the red, orange, and yellow regions as the increased wealth turns them into lavender and blue. As we are contemplating trading the problems of consumption for those of population, let us note that a first-world citizen consumes 32 times the energy than does a third-world citizen. In this top 15% of the world, about 1 billion people use 80% of the world's resources. As illustration, a U.S. citizen uses on average 30 times more energy than does an Indian citizen. And since there are 320 million Americans in the U.S., the United States consumes as much as 9.6 billion Indians. The population of India, by the way, is just around 1.3 billion. So let's be clear about the logic behind the solution we are contemplating, indeed hoping for. Optimistically, the world population will swell for the rest of this century, stabilizing at about 11 billion. And to reach this goal, we will need to turn the rural poor into urban middle-class consumers. Let us note that the consumption that has done the environmental damage so far comes from the two relatively small areas A and B, between 1900 and 2000. Over this already absurdly destructive economy of 20th century production and consumption, we are contemplating a 20-fold increase during this century. So, since it is not the number of people per se that directly impacts the earth, but rather the total consumption of a population, the resources consumed and the waste produced, then lowering population by increasing consumption is an ersatz solution. It's a substitute for a real solution.